Okay, so try to situate whatever it is that you were, what the rich ideas that you were sharing with each other, and imagine yourself as, now you're Miguel, right, who's trying to write this book within this Disruptive Cartographers series. And in our preface to the series, and in each of the books in this series, this is what we have printed. In the first paragraph of the description, the three co-editors of the series, Carmen, myself, and Gary, write this, right? And so this is the first paragraph that describes the series and the books in the series. And to try to imagine what you just shared in light of this metaphor of mapping, right? Disruptive cartographer. Maps are functional and aesthetic, dealing with the arts. They establish and make visible place, space, time, and distance in terms of scale and relationships that are inevitably influenced by the cartographer's own coordinates. Yeah. Mapping as a process is not as objective as it might seem. And the maps produced are not beyond bias. Maps are tools of power employed by empires to mark and represent their domains territorially, economically, politically, culturally, religiously, with respect to gender, sexuality, etc., etc., etc. Mapping also orients resistance by contesting borders, shifting perspective, challenging omissions, retrieving what was rendered invisible or insignificant, disrupting the illusion that certain maps or particular ways of mapping are necessarily normative. Queer God de Amor. What were some of the things that you said? Anyone?
The word queer, for me, it has just too much negativity involved in it. If someone came up to me and said, "Oh, I recognize you, you're queer," I would say, well, what is it about me that makes me look queer? I was and still am comfortable with the term gay, but I also understand that this organization, Dignity, was predominantly gay in its earlier stages, and the women didn't like that. And so they organized, and then they wanted to be lesbians. And then we've gotten, GLBTQRSTUVWXYZ, and we're including more here, and then we put a plus sign in because we don't want to have 17 letters in the thing. But to say God is queer, that's just very difficult for me to hold on to.
Thank you.
To grasp.
That's good. I appreciate it because these are some of the discussions that are going to be right. Anyone else? Yes.
I have no trouble thinking of God as queer, and I have that background too with using the word as an insult. But when it's applied to the divine is such a great mystery that we can't possibly fathom. It's beyond our imagination. It transcends space and time. It's something that is so beyond us that it really is queer. It's odd. It's strange. It doesn't fit with our lived experience. God is beyond all that. And so calling God queer makes perfect sense to me when you think about God that way.
So you picked up on, and that's exactly how one of the, Karl Rahner, who's one of the great theologians of our times, right?
Yeah.
He oftentimes has a language of the mystery of God, and I was mentored into that by Catherine Malala because he oftentimes, and I love the mysterium, the mystery, right? And that points to the ineffable, right? John of the Cross is in his apophatic and cataphatic, the todo nada, the this and that. That is also part of that, at the heart of his of the mystics' theology. And if you notice, this is also central to my argument of why God is queer. And in the description that Fordham put out, and in all the descriptions of my book, this is what I have said. It's to out-divine queerness, and what I mean by that is really to affirm what the Catholic theological imagination has always affirmed about God, is that, and the next thing I say is that is the ineffability of divine life. And this is why it goes back to Zach's question about, remaining humble about not saying this is God. So no, God is queer, but as long as by queer, this is what I mean. It's ineffable. It does not mean that God is then reduced to all of a sudden a possession of queer bodies, whereby then now God can be encountered outside of that. And in the book, while I push for the metaphors and the images and the theology to go beyond the heteronormative, which I'm much, I know that this is I lived a committed relationship with a wonderful woman. I have 4 incredible kids. I know what it is to live in a heteronormative relationship and to pray to God in heteronormative terms. I know what that is. And that's a lot of those images, a lot of those symbols, a lot of those ways of naming God are perfectly holy, wonderful, etc. But they don't speak to the whole of the experience. And so that's why God has to be queer. At least in Díaz's understanding of queerness, right? So, thank you.
Yeah.
Someone else?
I wish we'd studied the mystics more. Then that would make more sense. But Matthew Fox complains about that all the time. That the people who are candidates for the priesthood do not study the mystics. They don't understand what
they're also feared.
They're feared. Yeah.
They're feared.
Exactly.
It's interesting. It's interesting because my good buddy here, Juan de la Cruz, has become sometimes it's like. Sometimes my husband is jealous of Juan de la Cruz. But he was confined, and he calls it being in the belly of the whale. He was put in a little cellar by religious, because along with his good friend Teresa de Avila, they were reforming the Carmelites, and so oftentimes the rebel rousers. That's another thing that for me to queer is to disrupt. That's why the Disruptive Cartographers series, those disruptors are oftentimes troublemakers or are seen to be troublemakers. I think that they're really speaking out of the heart of the theological Christian tradition, but they're seen somehow or other as being outsiders or persons who don't tap into that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Someone else? Just one more. Yes.
My first thought was that it was a very unlikely pairing because we tend to think of God as this perfect, loving, nothing is wrong, everything is the source of all goodness, right? And then we have queer. What's the worst thing any male can be is a queer, okay? Especially in my generation growing up. So it's absolutely the worst. So pairing the best with the worst seems unlikely, and from some people's minds, possibly insulting. But it also has the value of being provocative in that it evokes, it calls out, in the root meaning of the word, it calls out an opportunity to rethink those relationships. So it may actually be a very brilliant choice.
Great. And also from that perspective, we oftentimes think, of the preferential option for the marginalized, the oppressed. Those that have been marginalized, it's better to say, because it's like, people just don't exist as marginalized. We marginalize, right? We oppress. And so from that perspective, pairing these two, if the understanding is queerness associated with some form of human oppression, marginalization, then they belong together because God takes the side of those who suffer, of the poor, of the oppressed, of those who marginalized, etc. So thanks. That's great. Jack,
I actually really appreciate that. There's this dichotomy almost between queerness and God, and it makes me wonder. And I think this is part of the thrust of this book is what experience is acceptable for understanding God, right? Do we allow the absence of God or the presumed absence of God to tell us about who God is? The negativity, the painful moments of being called queer in the experience of a lot of people here. How does that inform who God is for us? Do we allow that to speak to us? Do we allow... There's this concept that Melissa Pagan, who will be here tomorrow, right, brought up at a conference last fall, the very first Queer Theologians of Color conference with 3 people in this room. Again, if you'd like to stand up, you're welcome.
Oh, I'm here.
But Greg and Melissa are going to
Yes.
have a discussion of this plenary, so yes.
But Dr. Pagan brought up this idea of the epistemic pilgrimage, the epistemology as a way of knowing what experiences do we allow. Again, that question: what experience do we allow to inform us about who God is? Kind of searching through those dark places, those dark alleys. Very much what John of the Cross does in Dark Night of the Soul. That for me is, at least as I continue to struggle in my own way through my PhD process, that for me is one of the big questions about this concept of queer. Where are the places we don't want to go? Where are the places where God has denied us? And how can those moments, those places, tell us more, not just about who God is, but about who we are as well? So.
Let's see how much time we have left. We have about 10 minutes. So why don't we get to some of the questions? Any questions, and then wrap up?
Well, I know you did want to read a little of...
I did want to read a little bit of the, it's just such a beautiful, O llama de amor viva que tiernamente si eres de mi alma en lo más profundo centro, pues ya no eres esquiva. Acaba ya si quieres, rompe la tela deste, dulce encuentro. Translated, O living flame of love that tenderly wounds my soul in its deepest center. Shy you are no more. Do it now, if you will. Break the veil of this sweet encounter. Hence the title of, Rompe la tela, deste, dulce, encuentro. How could you be reading this and not think in any ways, both spiritually and in an embodied erotic way? It's just very difficult not to put those two together. And then in the next few verses, he calls upon God in a very Trinitarian way, using very evocative language to, and in Spanish you see the fluidity too, where sometimes John as mystic is speaking about the soul as kind of like the bride, but very much, at times also he's speaking himself as the spouse of Christ. And so the book opens with one of my favorite verses from Noche Oscura, en mi pecho florido que para él solo guardaba, on my flowering chest, which is, by the way, where I got we got the inspiration for so Carmen Naco Fernandez actually found the image and said, Miguel, this is a wonderful image from a Latino artist. And so the image of the book, it's it's an artist, and he's straight. He's a Mexican-American artist, and he's drawing attention to the heart, and it has 3 flowers. The flowers actually represent his mother and the 2 daughters. But we thought, oh my gosh, this captures this poem, this verse from Dark Night, en mi pecho florido que para él solo guardaba, on my flowering chest, so there are the flowers, right, that I saved for him alone. There I caressed him and I fell asleep as the breezes fanned our bodies. So it's just a beautiful way. And there he's speaking in the first person, on my, flowering chest, which I saved for him alone. So anyway, the poems are the primary sourcing for my book, and I make an argument how poetry is always open-ended, and how Juan de la Cruz himself, even when he writes the commentaries, or in fact not even, but as he writes the commentary, almost reluctantly, he cautions and says, these commentary, the commentaries that I write on these poems are not to be taken as like the last resort on the evocative nature of a poem. They're to be taken, because God in the Spirit inspires and leads us into new ways of thinking and rethinking, the power of art. And so I'm just doing what the mystic invited me to do, which is to take his poems and reinterpret them. So. Some questions? Anyone some of the questions that may surface? Yes?
Do you want to turn this off? Do you want for the
Oh, yes,
questions?
please.
Are
Yes.
people comfortable with?
Let's do that. Let's turn it off. Yeah,
Okay.
that'll be great.